You know the kind of adult who's weirdly calm in chaos but gets irritated when life gets too loud for no reason? The one who doesn't overshare, doesn't post their healing, and can sit in silence without needing to fill it. They're not cold. They're protecting something. If you grew up in the 90s, welcome. You're about to feel very seen. Because people treat the 90s like it was just cartoons, VHS, and nostalgia. But psychology treats it like a training ground. People call 90s kids detached or hard to read. Psychology calls it adaptation. Your nervous system learned safety in a world with less surveillance and more space. Here's the thing. The 90s raised you in the last world that was both low surveillance and high freedom. No tracking, no read receipts, no constant check-ins. You could disappear for hours and still be considered normal. And that did something to your brain. It taught you to self-regulate without an audience. Psychologists call this optimal arousal theory. Some nervous systems feel best with more stimulation, more noise, more people, more movement. Others feel best with less. And if you grew up in the 90s, your baseline for enough stimulation is usually lower than people realize, because quiet wasn't a luxury, it was normal. Silence in the car. Long afternoons with nothing planned, waiting without instantly reaching for a screen. You didn't label that as empty, your body learned it as safe. Here's what's happening. The 90s forced your brain to build an inner world. Because boredom back then wasn't a 5-second gap, it lasted long enough to turn into imagination. If you wanted a song, you waited for it on the radio. If you wanted to talk to someone, you called a landline and hoped the right person answered. Busy signal, no voicemail, you just waited. If you missed your show, you missed it. If you wanted an answer, you went to a library or asked someone who actually knew. And the wild part is, you don't realize how much this trained you until you meet someone who didn't have to live that way. Someone who grew up with endless stimulation on tap. Because when entertainment is infinite, boredom never gets the chance to do its job. It never has time to turn into creativity. It never has time to turn into problem solving. It never has time to turn into self-knowledge. But you spent hours inside your own head, not as a lifestyle, as a default. That's why so many 90s kids can sit alone without panicking. That's why silence doesn't feel like rejection to you. It feels like neutral ground, like space, like breathing room. And when time has weight, you become the kind of person who can sit with discomfort without collapsing. Now here's the next layer people miss. It wasn't just boredom, it was control. In the 90s, life had limits, not just limits in technology, limits in access, limits in reachability, limits in how quickly the world could demand a response from you. If someone wanted you, they had to call the house phone. If you weren't there, you simply weren't there. You were unreachable. And that experience, being unreachable without guilt, built something in you. It taught your nervous system that you don't have to respond instantly to be a good person. So when modern life expects constant availability, it can feel like a low-level invasion, like you're being pulled on a leash, like you never fully get your mind back. That's why late replying for you isn't just a habit, it's an instinct. It's your nervous system saying, I need space before I can be present. And this is where the privacy thing comes in. In the 90s, your mistakes usually stayed local. If you embarrassed yourself, it didn't become permanent evidence. There wasn't a camera in every pocket. There wasn't an algorithm ready to resurrect your worst moment years later. So you learned something deep without ever putting it into words. Visibility is risky. Not because you're paranoid, because privacy was the default. And there's a difference between needing privacy to recharge and hiding because being seen feels unsafe. One is peace, the other is protection. That's why a lot of 90s grown adults have a reflex for keeping things private. You can love people and still hate being perceived. You can be emotionally deep and still not want to perform it publicly. And when modern culture says share everything, your nervous system hears expose yourself. And here's a detail that makes this even stronger. In the 90s, you could reinvent yourself quietly. You could have a weird phase, a bad haircut, a cringe personality era, and then grow out of it. And unless someone kept a photo album, it faded. Your past didn't follow you around in HD. It softened. It turned into a story. Today, people grow up documented, tagged, archived. Their identity becomes searchable before it becomes stable. So if you feel resistant to being constantly visible, that's not you being old-fashioned. That's you remembering a world where your inner life didn't have to be public to be real. And that's also where the humor comes from. 90s kids mastered a specific kind of comedy, dry, ironic, self-deprecating. Not because they don't care, but because irony is armor. If you can joke first, it can't hurt you as much. If you keep it light, nobody gets close enough to see what you actually feel. People call that detached. Psychology calls it a coping strategy. Because a lot of 90s kids grew up during a strange emotional environment. Adults were stressed, but they didn't always explain why. Big feelings existed, but the language for them wasn't common in everyday households. So you learned to read tone, to read energy, to read what was not being said. You became emotionally observant, not necessarily emotionally expressive. And that creates a very specific adult, someone who notices everything and reveals very little. Now here's the status upgrade nobody talks about. 90s kids are unusually adaptable. You grew up translating worlds, analog first, figuring things out, making do, troubleshooting. That's why you can walk into a new job, a new app, a new city, and quietly become competent. Not because you're fearless, because you learned early that competence is safety. You don't just adapt, you translate worlds. You can talk to older generations without judging them for being slow. You can talk to younger generations without being intimidated by speed. You understand what was gained and what was lost. And the part that explains your late reply habit is simple. Urgency didn't raise you, space did. Constant reachability can feel like someone demanding access to your brain all day. But there's a cost. Some 90s grown adults don't ask for help when they need it. They'll say, "I'm good," when they mean, "I don't want to be a burden." They'll disappear when they're overwhelmed. They'll delay replying when they feel pressured. And the world reads that as distance, when it's really self-protection. Because if you grew up learning to solve boredom alone, solve problems alone, regulate alone, then asking for support can feel strangely unnatural, like you're breaking an internal rule you never agreed to consciously, but still live by. So here's the real question. Do you crave solitude because it fills you up, or because leaving your comfort zone feels too heavy? Because one is peace, and the other is hiding. And one of the most confusing parts of being a 90s kid as an adult is that you can be both. You can be someone who genuinely loves quiet, and also someone who uses quiet to avoid being overwhelmed. The difference is what happens after you've had space. If space restores you, it's healthy. If space traps you, it's a signal. And you don't have to judge yourself for that. You just have to notice it. Psychologists sometimes call this low stimulation preference, a nervous system that doesn't need constant input to feel alive. You don't need the world to entertain you. Your inner world is rich enough. So if you're someone who gets calmer the moment your phone is on silent, rewatches comfort shows like it's medicine, replies late because instant access feels invasive, feels safest when nobody expects an immediate response, misses boredom the way people miss a place, still remembers the feeling of being offline like it was a kind of freedom, gets drained by group chats more than actual conversation, feels allergic to performative vulnerability online. You're not broken. You're built for depth over noise, for peace over performance. Tell me, what's the most 90s thing about your personality? And if you want the part nobody explains, why 90s kids burn out in modern always-on culture, why your brain treats constant pings like a threat, and how to build a life that gives your nervous system the space it grew up with. The next video is going to hit you harder than this one. Click it. You'll understand why.